So anyway, this was back in July of 2007. Me and my buddies Mark and Dave took my old Ford Ranger out to the state forest for a weekend campout. The truck had that pine tree air freshener swinging from the mirror. We had a cooler of Mountain Dew, and Mark had the radio tuned to some classic rock station. Sweet Home Alabama was playing when we finally turned onto the dirt road. I mean, it was one of those perfect summer days where nothing can go wrong. We threw our tents up and then split up to gather firewood. I wandered a little further than the others, pushing through some scrub, and that's when I spotted it. A red plastic canister, the kind you'd keep gasoline in for a lawnmower, half buried under a pile of last year's leaves. I pulled it out, and there was this faint rustle of dry leaves and something scurrying away beneath it. I froze for a second, but I guess it was just a chipmunk. I called the guys over, and we all stood there staring at it like we'd found buried treasure. The canister had no label, just a few scratch marks where something had been torn off. I unscrewed the cap and took a sniff. It had that sharp, something sour smell, not quite like the gas I remembered from filling up the Ranger. Dave said it smelled a little off, but Mark laughed and said it was just stale gasoline. Maybe it had been sitting there a couple years. I figured he was right. Old gas just goes sour. I didn't know then that this would be the last time I'd look in a mirror and recognize myself. We carried the canister back to the fire pit and set it down next to the pile of dead branches. The sun had dipped behind the trees by then, and the air was getting that cool dampness that settles in the woods at night. I remember looking at that red plastic container, feeling a little prickle at the back of my neck. But yeah, I ignored it. I cracked another Mountain Dew and started stacking kindling. By the time it was fully dark, we had a decent stack of wood built up in the stone ring. I was the one who usually got the fire going, so I grabbed the canister. The plastic felt greasy in my hand, and when I tilted it, the liquid inside sloshed with this thin metallic sound, almost like water in a tin can, not the heavier glug of gasoline. I unscrewed the cap again, and that sour chemical smell hit me even harder this time. It reminded me exactly of the nail polish remover wipes my sister used to keep in her bathroom. I hesitated there, holding the open canister over the logs. Mark saw me freeze and shouted over, asking if I was going to light it or just admire it all night. Dave added that I was being paranoid, that the stuff was probably some hunter's leftover fuel, and it would burn just fine. I mean, they were both staring at me, and I didn't want to be the guy who ruined the trip by overthinking. I guess I wanted to believe them. So I told myself, maybe it's just a different blend, or maybe the summer heat made it smell stronger. I tipped the canister and poured it over the wood. I noticed the liquid seemed to bead and evaporate almost instantly off the dry bark, leaving only a faint shimmer. I thought, okay, that's weird. But then I immediately came up with a reason. It was a hot July night, the logs were bone dry, and any fluid would flash off quickly. I remember mumbling that exact thing out loud, like I was trying to convince myself more than them. But yeah, I ignored the knot in my stomach. I set the canister a few yards away, pulled out a matchstick from the box in my pocket, and scraped it against the striker. The match flared up in my fingers, that familiar little crack and snap of sulfur igniting. I tossed it onto the soaked kindling, and for a split second, nothing happened. The little flame just sat there, and I thought, great, it's too wet to light. And then the world went white. There was no whoosh, no slow spread of fire, just an instantaneous, boiling blue-white flash that swallowed everything. The air itself seemed to ignite. The crack of the explosion hit my ears a moment after the light, and then the heat slammed into my face, my neck, my chest. I didn't even have time to close my eyes. The pain wasn't like touching a hot pan. It was like my skin was melting. I heard a horrible wet snap that I later realized was my own shirt catching fire. I fell backward and I could hear Mark and Dave screaming, but it sounded muffled, like they were underwater. I was rolling on the ground, trying to put myself out. The smell was the worst part, sweet and charred, my own hair burning, the polyester of my t-shirt fusing into my skin. I mean, you know how synthetic fabric just shrivels? It did that right on my arms. I kept thinking, I just wanted a campfire. I just wanted a normal fire. I thought the flames would flash up and then settle down. That's what gasoline does. But this wasn't gasoline. My friends were slapping at me with their denim jackets, yelling my name over and over, and I could hear the wet slap of cloth on my burning skin. The last thing I clearly remember from that night is the sound of my own voice making a noise I'd never heard before. A low, animal moan that didn't sound human at all. And then the darkness closed in, and the only thing left was the distant rustle of trees and someone crying, "Jake, stay awake, man. Please stay awake." I don't remember much about getting to the truck, just fragments. Mark's face pale in the moonlight, shouting something I couldn't understand. Dave's arms hooked under my shoulders, dragging me across the damp earth. The ground was soft. I think it had rained earlier that week. I could smell the wet leaves and dirt mixing with something else. Something cooked. It took me a while to realize that cooked smell was me. They laid me across the back seat of the Ranger. Someone threw a wet flannel shirt over my chest and the cold fabric made me scream. You know, I didn't even know I could make a sound like that. Dave kept saying he was sorry over and over. The engine roared and we lurched backwards onto the dirt road. Every time the tires hit a rut, it felt like someone was peeling off another layer of my skin. I guess that's what was happening. The truck had that little black ice air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. I could smell it through all the burnt flesh and charred hair, that fake chemical pine scent. To this day, I can't stand that smell. Mark was driving, and I could hear the muffled beat of the radio. 1979 by Smashing Pumpkins was playing. I remember that because I tried to focus on the melody to push the pain somewhere else. The odometer on the dash glowed green. I stared at the numbers ticking over, mile after mile. It felt like we were driving to the moon. I kept thinking, I just need to stay awake. I guess it's just a concussion. It'll pass. Then I'd slip under again, and the only sound was the rustle of that wet shirt every time I breathed, and a low animal moan that might have been coming from me. I remember the hospital lights. They were so bright, these long fluorescent tubes that burned through my eyelids. Someone was cutting off what was left of my clothes. The scissors were cold against my ribs. Then a nurse squeezed a clear gel onto my face and chest. It felt like ice, but the relief lasted about 2 seconds before the burning came back. You know, it was like the gel just reminded the nerves that they were supposed to be screaming. A doctor leaned over me. He had kind eyes, but his voice was flat, clinical. He said I had second-degree burns on about 15% of my body, face, neck, both arms, a good chunk of my chest. He told me I was lucky. I mean, the eyes were spared. My vision was blurry, but it still worked. I didn't feel lucky. Later, a county sheriff's deputy showed up. He pulled a chair up to my bed and asked me what I'd poured on the fire. I tried to tell him, but my throat felt like sandpaper. I whispered something about a red canister in the woods. He nodded and wrote it down on a form. A 2008 registration form. I remember that because I thought about how a year ago I was filling out a form for a summer job, not for a chemical burn incident. They ran tests on the residue. The lab report came back a couple days later. The deputy read it to me. Acetone, toluene, methanol, industrial solvents. The kind of stuff you use to clean engine parts or cook meth. He said someone probably left it out there from a mobile lab or some garage cleanup gone wrong. No way to trace it, no one to blame. Maybe some tourist auto mechanics left it. I clung to that. It was easier than thinking someone did it on purpose. So anyway, the doctor came back with a mirror. He held it up so I could see the raw, red patches and the white gauze. He said the scars would fade, but they'd never disappear. The room went very silent after that, just the soft whisper of the IV drip and my own breathing, which sounded like a rusted hinge. That's when I knew I would carry this forever. 3 weeks later, Mark went back. I was still in the burn unit, so he went alone. He told me about it afterward, in this hushed voice, like he was afraid someone would overhear. He drove the Ranger up the same dirt road, past the spot where we'd parked that night. The fire pit was still there, a circle of scorched stones. The ground around it was black and dead. He looked for the red canister. It was gone. Not thrown aside, not melted into the dirt, just gone. The spot under the tree where I'd found it had been disturbed. There was a shallow hole, and inside it, a metal box. Like an old ammunition case, all rusted. He pried it open, and the smell that came out was damp and rotten, like dead leaves and old paper. Inside was a spiral notebook, a mead one with a faded cover. He flipped through it. The handwriting was small and precise, in cheap blue Bic pen. It was a journal, sort of. Pages of chemical formulas, ratios, boiling points. A whole recipe for what the person called safe ignition without traces. And then, on the last page, a single line. Waiting for the next fool. Camera installed. Mark froze. He looked up, scanning the trees. At first he saw nothing, just branches and leaves. And then he spotted it. A trail camera, the kind hunters strap to a tree to watch for deer motion. But it wasn't pointed at a game trail. It was pointed directly at the fire pit. A tiny red light was blinking. He said he just bolted, didn't take the journal, didn't take the film. He ran to the truck and peeled out. I guess he thought, maybe it's just someone's sick prank. But yeah, the way he told it, I could hear the shake in his voice. That camera had been watching us the whole time. And now whoever said it knew exactly who we were. The picture of my truck was right there on one of the journal pages, a Polaroid stapled to the paper. That was 1.5 years ago. I live alone now in a small house at the edge of town. The windows are always closed. Most of the mirrors are covered with old bed sheets. I can't stand to look at myself. The scars pulled tight across my cheeks, my forehead, my hands. I look like a melted candle. I mean, people stare in the grocery store, so I stopped going. One morning I found an envelope under my front door. No stamp, no address, just my name written in that same small, precise handwriting Mark had described. I stood there for a long time, just holding it. My breath started coming in these short, ragged gasps. I finally opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. The picture showed my own front porch, and sitting right there, on the welcome mat, was a red plastic canister. It looked exactly like the one I'd found in the woods, except now it had a new white label stuck on the side. On the label, in black marker, was a single word and a question mark. Gasoline? I yanked the door open so hard the hinges snapped. The porch was empty. No canister. No footprints. Nothing but the faint, sour smell of acetone hanging in the air. And then I heard it. A high, distant whistle coming from the trees behind my house. The exact same 2-note whistle me and the guys used to joke about, the one we'd heard out in the woods that night. I slammed the door and grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial. I called Mark. It rang once, twice, and then someone picked up. There was just silence on the other end. Not static, a heavy listening silence. I whispered his name. Nothing. And then a soft little snap, like a twig breaking. The line went dead. I stood there for what felt like an hour, listening to the dial tone and that whistle, drifting through the walls. I guess I could have called the police, but what would I say? Someone left a picture and put the same whistle on a recording? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe it's just kids messing around. But yeah, deep down, I know. It's not kids. Whoever made that solvent, whoever set that camera, they know where I live. And they just wanted me to know they haven't forgotten. This isn't over. It's never going to be over. So anyway, this was back in 2018. I had a red Toyota RAV4, and I was driving upstate late in the evening to meet some friends. They'd rented a cabin through a vacation app. You know the type. I was already running behind, so when the GPS popped up a reroute saying I could save 40 minutes, I took it without thinking. I remember thinking the detour was a stroke of luck, a glitch in the algorithm that would finally get me there early. That was the last time the cursor on that blue dot moved in my favor. I exited the highway, and within a mile the asphalt crumbled into gravel. I guess I just trusted the app. It was 2018, who doesn't? The headlights pushed against a wall of trees on both sides, and I had that MGMT song, Electric Feel, playing low on the radio. I rolled down the window for a second, and the first thing that hit me was the silence. Not peaceful silence, but a dead, heavy quiet. Then a rustle in the underbrush, sharp and close. I couldn't see anything. I rolled the window back up. The signal bars on my phone were vanishing. I told myself it was just a rural dead zone, that the shortcut was probably a fire road locals used. But my heart was beating faster. The GPS voice kept saying, "Continue straight," as if nothing was wrong. I turned off the music so I could listen. It was just the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel and that thick silence pressing in from outside. I remember thinking, I'll be there soon. This will all be funny later. But I didn't laugh. I just gripped the wheel and watched the road narrow. You know when you get that feeling that you should turn back, but you don't because you've already come too far? That was me. The gravel turned into packed dirt, then mud. I could feel the tires slipping a little, and every few seconds a branch would crack against the undercarriage. The sound was like a gunshot in that quiet. I kept the window up after that earlier rustle, but the damp earth smell seeped in through the vents anyway. Wet soil and decaying leaves. The GPS was still working, the screen glowing with that offline map mode. It just kept saying, "Continue straight." No turns, no alternate routes. Just straight, deeper into the trees. I remember I was wearing my favorite red flannel, and I caught myself gripping the sleeve, like that would help. But yeah, I was starting to argue with myself. I'd say, it's just a dead zone, you know? Rural areas are full of them. The map data is probably old, but it still knows the main path. Then the headlights caught something strange. An old wooden sign nailed to a tree, hand-painted with an arrow and the words "Camp End" that I couldn't find on any map. I stopped the car for a second and squinted at it. The paint was faded, but it looked recent enough. The arrow pointed straight ahead. I told myself it was just an old hunting camp, nothing to worry about. But my hands were shaking. I started driving again, and the road dipped into a shallow stream. Water splashed up over the hood. The GPS didn't react. It just recalculated for a split second and then said, "In 200 feet, turn right." I laughed, a nervous laugh, because there was no road there, just a narrow track barely wider than the car. So I turned, branches scraping both sides like fingernails on a chalkboard. That's when I heard the first real crack that sounded different, like something underneath the car that shouldn't break did. It was a low metallic pop, and the steering wheel pulled hard to the left for a second before the traction control light blinked on. I mean, I knew something was really wrong when the trees opened up and the road just ended. Not like a turnaround or a clearing, but a sudden drop into nothing. The headlights lit up a ravine choked with dead bushes and rotting logs. The GPS voice, calm as ever, said, "You have arrived." I hit the brakes and just sat there, engine idling. That's when I smelled it. At first, just the heavy rot of wet wood and mushrooms, but underneath something sour, almost chemical, like burnt plastic or ozone. I got out of the car. I don't know why. I guess some part of me still thought I could find a way around. The ground was spongy under my boots. I walked to the edge and looked down. It was steep, maybe 20 feet, with a muddy stream at the bottom. No bridge, no tire tracks, nothing. I pulled out my phone and tried to call my friends. Dead silence. No dial tone, no beeps, just nothing. Like the speaker was disconnected. I held it up to check the signal. No bars, and even the offline map was frozen. The blue dot just a gray circle now. I remember thinking, maybe the map is outdated. I mean, there used to be a bridge here or something. That had to be it. But then why was the GPS still talking? And then I noticed the smell was stronger outside the car, like it was rising from the ravine. I coughed and backed away. That's when I heard the click. It came from behind me, from the RAV4, a soft, metallic click, like a door handle being tested. I spun around. The headlights were still on, blinding me. I couldn't see anyone, but the driver's door was still open from when I got out. I swear I left it open. But that click, it was the passenger door. And then the interior lights flickered once. I stood frozen, staring at the dark shape inside that I hadn't noticed before. It was just a silhouette, but it was sitting in my seat, and I could feel it watching me through the windshield. I walked back to the RAV4 on legs that didn't feel like mine. My brain was still stuck on the sour chemical smell and that metallic click I'd heard. When I got close enough to see the tires and the headlight beams, I stopped. All four of them were flat. Not just flat, but slashed. Clean cuts, like someone had used a hunting knife. I remember a tiny, stupid thought. Maybe I drove over something, but I knew that wasn't true. Then I saw the passenger door was closed. I'd left it open. I was sure of it. My keychain, a heavy metal coin I'd carried for years, felt suddenly useless in my pocket. I took another step and froze. There was a shape sitting in the driver's seat. A man. He had the hood of a dark jacket pulled up, so I couldn't see his face, just the outline of his shoulders and the faint reflection of the dashboard lights on something in his lap. It looked like an old router box with a blinking red light. The jammer. He turned his head toward me, still blurred by the windshield. His voice came through the open window, a low whisper, like he was telling me a secret. He said he'd been tracking my signal for miles. He told me he'd spoofed the GPS, sent me down that road, and turned on the jammer when I was deep enough. He said it all so casually, like he'd done it 100 times before. Then he whispered, "Give me the keys." My mind went blank. For a second, I almost laughed, like maybe this was some weird local guy, a crazy hermit who stole cars. Maybe if I just handed over the keys, he'd let me walk away. But then I looked at the dark hole of the ravine behind me and the slashed tires, and I knew I had no reason to trust that. So anyway, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keychain, and threw it as hard as I could into the ravine. I heard the soft, metallic clink of the coin hitting a rock far below. The man didn't lunge or shout. He just sighed, a whisper of air that carried through the silent car. And then I ran. I didn't look back. I crashed into the tree line opposite the ravine, branches whipping against my face. Behind me, I heard the RAV4's door open with that solid, heavy thunk, then slam shut. It wasn't a frantic slam. It was controlled. That man was not in a hurry. He didn't yell at me to stop. I just heard footsteps, slow and steady, crushing dead pine needles. I ran deeper, sliding down a slope into a shallow gully. The smell of pine hit me strong as I crushed wet needles under my hands. I found a fallen trunk and threw myself behind it, my chest heaving. You know that kind of fear where your lungs burn, but you don't dare gasp too loud. I guess I hoped he'd walk past. He can't see in the dark, I told myself. He's just following the sound. The footsteps stopped maybe 20 yards above me on the ridge. I counted the silence. 1 second, 2, 3. I pressed my forehead into the bark and tried to breathe through my nose. The pine sap was sticky on my fingers. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and then, faintly, the crunch of a single footstep shifting on gravel. He was listening. He was standing perfectly still, listening for me. I didn't move. I don't know how long I crouched there. Minutes, maybe. Every time I thought he'd gone, I'd hear another step, deliberate and slow, testing the ground. He circled the ridge above me, never coming closer, but never retreating. It was like he wanted me to know he was still out there. And then, just when the silence stretched so long I thought I might risk it, a twig snapped not 10 feet away, and I realized something that turned my blood cold. I couldn't hear him breathing. Nothing. Just the whisper of pine boughs and the faint dripping of water from the ferns. I knew he was right there, but he made no human sound at all. After that, time kind of dissolved. I have flashes, but no order. My phone was dead weight in my pocket. I drank from streams when the thirst got bad. At some point, I lost the flannel shirt, left it tangled on a branch. I walked through rain. I didn't eat. And then I remember the sound of a helicopter, distant somewhere to the east. I stumbled into a clearing, waving my arms, but the canopy was too thick. But yeah, I told myself they just couldn't see me, that's all. Once at night I saw a light, a single flashlight beam bobbing through the trunks. It moved too smoothly, too evenly, not like someone searching, more like someone pacing. I tried to call out, but my voice was a whisper, raw from dehydration. I watched it for a while, maybe an hour, maybe 10 minutes, before it blinked out. I still don't know if it was the man with the jammer still hunting for his keys or if my brain just made it up. The third day brought another sound. Footsteps again, but these were different. Quick, hesitant, human. A man's voice called out, and a figure in a red jacket appeared between the trees, a mushroom picker. He gave me lukewarm water from a metal flask and spoke to me in a gentle tone I couldn't quite focus on. I remember his red jacket leading me like a beacon through the endless green. When we reached a trail, I turned back to look at the forest. I swear the gap we'd come through wasn't there anymore. Just a solid wall of branches, as if the trees had moved or someone had pulled them shut behind me. I stared until I heard the man say we had to keep moving, and I realized I was crying without knowing it. So now I'm in a hospital room with a plastic cup of water that's gone warm on the bedside table. The air smells like antiseptic, sterile and sharp. The police came. I told them everything. About the RAV4, the GPS reroute, the man, the jammer. They took notes and didn't smile. A few days later, they came back. They'd searched the area. Nothing. No car, no tire tracks, no sign of a jammer. Not even the keychain at the bottom of the ravine. The ravine itself, they said, wasn't as deep as I'd described. Maybe 8 feet, not 20. They think I hit my head after I got stuck, wandered into the woods, and made the rest up. I mean, that's what the doctors tell me too, that the mind fills in gaps. You know, trauma does strange things, but I know what the sour chemical smell was, and I know what that whisper sounded like. And the worst part is, the keys are still out there, somewhere. My metal coin keychain with my house key and my old apartment fob lying in wet leaves. I can't sleep because I picture that figure in the hood, still walking those woods with his quiet footsteps, still searching for them. Sometimes late at night, when the hospital corridor goes silent, I hear a rustle outside my door. Not footsteps, just a soft brush of fabric against the wall, like someone standing very still, listening. And I hold my breath and I wait, because a part of me knows that if he ever finds those keys, he'll know exactly where I live. And this time, he won't need to fake a GPS signal to find me. It was the fall of '98, I think. Me, Pete, and Eric piled into my old blue Ford F-150, a couple of 12 packs of Budweiser rattling in the back, and a Creedence cassette stuck in the deck. So anyway, we'd been making this trip up to Lake Echo for years. Quiet spot, nobody around. Good pike if you hit it right. I mean, you know how it is. Weekend trip, nothing special. We pulled off the gravel road around dusk, the air thick with pine sap and the soft lapping of the water against the shore. We hauled our gear down to that flat patch of dirt by the water's edge and started setting up the tent. That's when Pete stopped and said, "Hey, check this out." Stretched all the way around where we were about to camp was this old fishing net, just lying on the ground in a loose circle. Little brass bells tied to it every couple of feet. Looked ancient, the rope frayed and stained dark. I remember Eric laughed, said someone must have forgotten their crazy catfish rig. I knelt down and flicked one of the bells. It made a thin, empty sound. We didn't think twice. We just stepped over it, pitched the tent right in the middle, and lit the lantern. But that ratty old net with its little brass bells was the first thread in a trap we almost didn't escape. We grilled some sausages, drank a few beers, and watched the mist roll in. The forest was dead quiet. No crickets, no birds, just that lapping water. Pete joked that the silence felt like someone was holding their breath. I told him he was being dramatic. I guess I was already wrong by then. The next morning, I unzipped the tent to that same heavy quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, just the sharp bite of pine in the cold air. I stepped outside and nearly tripped over the net again. In daylight, the whole thing felt wrong. Pete was already up, holding his coffee, just staring at it. The net wasn't just some random line. It was laid out almost perfectly around the campsite, like someone had circled us while we slept. And those little bells, all tarnished, hung still and silent. I crouched and lifted a section of the rope. The fibers were dry and brittle, but the knots were tight, deliberate. Pete nudged a bell with the toe of his boot, and we heard that faint, metallic jingle. It was way too clean a sound for something so old. Eric came out, rubbing his hands together, and said it was probably some backwoods alarm system a hunter rigged up for bears. I guess that made sense, sort of. Made more sense than what my gut was whispering. You know, I kept looking at that rustle of net near the tree line, half expecting something to be tugging it from the other end. Nothing was, but my eyes kept being drawn to a smashed stump a dozen yards away, fresh axe marks gouged into the wood, sap still sticky. Definitely man-made. When I pointed it out, Pete just shrugged and said, "Maybe a firewood guy." But the marks were random, angry, like someone had just been hitting the stump to kill time. I flicked on my old Maglite keychain just to check the batteries, and I realized I was already dreading the night. I don't know what woke me first, the cold or the sound. The inside of the tent was freezing, and my Carhartt jacket was damp where I'd balled it up as a pillow. I was reaching for the thermos of coffee when the bell started. Not a light tap, not the wind. A sharp, frantic ringing, like someone had kicked the whole net at once. And then came the snap of a twig, loud and close, just outside the tent wall. Pete hissed my name in the dark. Eric was already scrambling for his boots, whispering, we needed to get out. Something was in the camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the fly. The beam cut through the mist and hit the net. Some of the bells were still trembling. The rope had been pulled tight in one spot, dragging through the dirt. Then I saw it, a shape, human, tall, standing just beyond the tree line, frozen mid-stride like it hadn't expected the light. It wore dark, shapeless clothes and I couldn't make out a face. The split second my light hit it, the thing turned and bolted, crashing through the brush with heavy, fast footsteps. I heard the bells jingle one last time before they stopped. The forest swallowed the sound whole. I yelled something, I don't even remember what, and the three of us just stood there, listening to the silence rush back in, heavier than before. We scrambled back into the tent, all of us breathing hard, fumbling with zippers and boots. Nobody said a word for a long minute. Then Eric whispered that we should have gone after it. Pete snapped back that running blind into the dark was exactly what that thing wanted. I didn't know what to think. My chest was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Pete decided to check the net again, just to see how close it had come. He took 2 steps out and his foot caught a loop. He went down hard, his hands smacking the frozen ground. When he crawled back in, his palm was sliced open, and I caught that sharp, something metallic smell of blood mixing with the damp earth on his jacket. I wrapped it with a bandana while he cursed under his breath. Then the footsteps started, not far, just inside the tree line. A slow, deliberate crunch of pine needles coming closer. I held my breath and pressed the light on my old Timex. The blue glow showed 3:17. I started humming something in my head, some Nirvana line about being in the way, just to block out the sound. The footsteps stopped. The quiet that followed was worse. You know, I kept telling myself it was just some local kid messing with us, maybe a bear cracking a branch. But I felt it, that weight in the air, like the forest was leaning in to listen. We zipped the tent shut and sat with our backs to each other. Nobody slept. Every time the wind nudged a bell, we flinched. I gripped that little Maglite until my fingers ached, and I swore that the second the sky turned gray, we were gone. Morning came slow, wrapped in a thick gray mist that made everything look dead. We didn't speak much. Pete's hand was stiff and crusted with dried blood. I grabbed my buck knife and held it open as we stepped toward the tree line where the figure had vanished. My red Bass Pro windbreaker was the only color in the whole gray world. The flattened grass was easy to follow. Whoever it was had run hard, leaving deep scuffs in the soil. About 50 yards in, the trail just stopped at a patch of ground covered with fresh pine boughs and branches. It looked too neat, too intentional. We stood there a second, none of us wanting to be the first to touch it. Eric kicked the branches aside. The smell of rotting wood and stale dirt hit us, cold and dead. Underneath was a pit, perfectly square, at least 4 meters deep. At the bottom, sharpened wooden stakes jutted up like a mouthful of teeth. A few of the tips were stained dark. I just stared. But yeah, when I saw those spikes, I couldn't breathe. It was meant for us. It was waiting. Pete whispered. Maybe it was an old bear trap, something left over from years ago. Nobody believed that. The net outside the tent, the bells waking us, the figure running. It was all a funnel. If we had sprinted after that shape in the dark, we would have dropped straight through. We didn't even pack the tent properly, just ripped it down and threw everything into the truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the latch on the gearbox. I dug out the Motorola satellite phone, something I kept for emergencies, and called the sheriff. The line crackled with static noise until a voice cut through. The sheriff arrived in a white Chevy Tahoe about an hour later. He was an older guy, calm but tired, like he'd seen too many weird things in these woods to get rattled. We walked him out to the pit and then deeper into the brush where Eric had spotted something else. A small clearing hidden by a fallen tree. It was a camp, old and abandoned. Rusted cans of beans, cigarette butts crushed into the dirt, and a spot where somebody had slept under a tarp for what looked like a long time. I mean, even the sheriff didn't know what to do. We just stood there, like, what do you say after something like that? He told us it was probably a squatter, maybe a poacher who'd lost his mind out here. But there were no papers, no ID, nothing to trace. The whole place smelled sour, like old sweat and fear. When we finally climbed back into the truck and pulled away, the silence between us was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. Months passed. I went back to my place in a quiet Portland suburb and tried to bury it all. Worked on the truck in the garage, stayed busy, let the routines eat up the days. The police interviews never turned into anything. No suspect, no leads. Just a file that got thinner every time I called. Some nights I'd sit on the back porch with a mug of cold coffee, listening to the wind rustle through dry leaves, and I'd almost convinced myself it was over. Then one evening around midnight, I heard it. A single high-pitched jingle. I froze. It came from the back porch, past the screen door. I told myself it was just the wind catching some forgotten wind chime or a loose nail. But I knew the sound. I'd heard it too many times in my sleep. I opened the door slow, my bare feet on the cold wood, and I saw it hanging from the railing. A small brass bell, tarnished and familiar, tied with a piece of frayed rope. I grabbed it and yanked it down. The bell rang once in my hand, then went quiet. I looked out into the yard, past the hedges, into the dark spaces between the streetlights. Nothing moved. I backed inside, locked the door, and leaned against the wall. So anyway, now I checked the locks 3 times, and you know that sound? I still hear it. In the walls, in my head. I don't think it will ever stop.